Hare Krishna, everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of the Hare Krishna Project podcast. This is episode number 113. Let's hope it's a lucky one. A big thank you to everyone from all over the world who tunes in to watch our podcast productions here at the Hare Krishna Project. We really support you tuning in each week. Don't forget, if you're watching this on YouTube, to hit that all-important subscribe button. If you haven't pressed it already, please hit the subscribe button and keep updated about future podcasts here from the Hare Krishna Project. And also, if you're watching this on Facebook, to either like or follow the Hare Krishna Project Facebook page. That's the other way you can keep updated about be kept updated about video productions from the Hare Krishna Project. Okay, episode 113. You know, I was only ever meant to do 10. We got to 113. And this week we're going back down under. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our guest. It's Damodara Prabhu. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Damodara Prabhu. Thank you.
It's great to have you with us. Now, I've just I wouldn't say reminded, I've just told Damodar that we actually met around 20 years ago at Bhaktivedanta Manor, but quite understandably, I was just a very, I don't know, studious 19-year-old asking lots of questions probably at the temple. And he understandably wouldn't remember. My first visit to the manor was, my goodness, almost 20 years ago. So it's great to connect again after 20 years. And I'm really pleased that Damodar and I have finally got round to recording this podcast. It's certainly been on my list for a while, and I'm really pleased that we've found this time to record it. Okay, so Damodar, we're going to start with the first question. It's the first question that every guest gets. It's like a warm-up question. So please tell us a bit about you and where you are from.
Yeah, thank you. So born in a devotee family. So although I wasn't raised as a Hare Krishna, exposed from quite an early age because of family members, my uncle and aunt in particular, they joined the manor right at the outset. They were even visiting Berry Place, Punya Shloka and Devaki Priya. My mum also became a devotee in due course. And I think my first visit to Bhaktivedanta Manor was age about 8, 1975. Never met Srila Prabhupada though. But I do remember having a picture of Radha and Krishna, of Krishna and Balaram actually, with all the cows on my wall, bedroom wall, and I used to chant the Hare Krishna mantra at the bottom of the of one of those Brijbasi prints. Moved into the ashram at the manor, age 17 in September '84.
Wow!
I was part of Rohini Nandan's Bhakta program, which was interrupted halfway through because he was exiled to Mauritius or somewhere by management at the time. But that was just fantastic. Rohini played a really big part in me and many devotees joining in that era. Brahmachari for about 5 years, various services, mostly Sankirtan, book distribution and so on. Did stints as a temple cook, stints as a Bhakta leader, Harinam leader on Oxford Street, and so on. Became a TP for a few years in a few different locations.
Wow.
And then around 98, retired as a TP and started work professionally in leadership development, Stephen Covey's company. And I've worked in various other professional circumstances and other consultancies for the last 26 years, it would seem. Moved to Australia in 2005, so I've been here for nearly 19 years. Married, 3 kids, 2 grandchildren. That's pretty much me in a nutshell.
Wow. Well, I have to say, you don't look or appear old enough to have grandchildren. Yeah, grandchildren. Wow. Wow, I feel like I've got so many questions to come back on in terms of what you've just told me. So TP, for anyone who doesn't understand, most of our viewers will, means temple president. I know, kind of. In which temples were you temple president at?
So the first one was Belfast in the early 90s. I was there only 15 months or so. And I learned a whole bunch from that first collision with reality in terms of what it meant to run a temple. Had all kinds of opinions and judgments of ISKCON leaders before that, and came out of it quite sober about the challenges of management. And that we will probably return to that. Then I was at Soho Street for about 3 years in the early to mid 90s, sometimes as a temple manager, but also as a temple president. Very, very fond memories there with Radha Ishwara and a wonderful team of devotees. Very fond memories of Belfast with Radha Madhava and a wonderful team of devotees. And then went to the manor in 95 through 98, retired in April 98, and moved to New Zealand at the time.
Wow. Quite a kind of whirlwind of experiences, certainly within ISKCON in the UK. Yeah. I've never been a temple president and probably never will be for lots of reasons. Okay, thank you for that explanation. I kind of loved how we kind of covered about 30 years in about 3 minutes then. Often when I ask a guest that question, we're still sitting here an hour later. Oh, tell me what happened. Okay, let's change kind of tact a bit and talk about some of the key themes and issues we're going to discuss today. Certainly, for a number of years, you've been I would say a high profile campaigner, actually a high profile campaigner, and one of the strongest voices, kind of calling on ISKCON to do more to protect children and to keep children safe from harm. Why have you taken on this role? And why is child protection so important to you?
This is definitely going to be a longer answer, and there's many elements to it. I also had an unusual upbringing in the sense that I didn't really get to know my mum till I was about 11. I only met my father when I was about 29. So that sense of being estranged from one's parents is something that I probably have in common with a lot of Gurukulis. I went to a boarding school as I was growing up, and I was also abused by a priest while I was there. So I understand the boarding school experience. I understand the abuse experience. I'm a father. I'm a grandfather. My wife is a Dallas Gurukul alumni. She was part of that original. So there's so many different ways in which, I would naturally be concerned and feel a sense of affinity for the cause. I think actually any human being, this is the single most, what's the right adjective here? Discouraging aspect of our society that we still don't seem to have got on top of creating a fully safe environment for children, or reckoning with our past in terms of the abuse that has been suffered and putting things straight. We still have, an underfunded CPO. We still have a child protection office. We still have problematic attitudes from leadership and so on. I have to say, I actually came to it fairly late. And I was really inspired by meeting devotees like Sanaka Rishi, who had been campaigning almost alone for a long period of time. And I have to say, when I first came across his campaigning, I reacted a little bit. I don't think I was yet even in touch with the experiences I'd had at boarding school at that point. But I reacted a little bit, you're taking the wrong approach. It's too adversarial and you're going to get people offside. You should represent the movement better. You shouldn't go after this one. You shouldn't go after that one. And I think I probably, instructed many Gurukulis at different times who might have been talking about their abuse experiences. Well, you need to see it through the lens of Krishna consciousness, and we all suffer. It's part of the general plan. We need to take our suffering with good grace. And I kind of realized that this was not the kind of response that was helpful to anybody. In fact, it was a part of the problem. I was a part of the problem. I probably had a big awakening when I watched the film Spotlight that came out in around 2015 about abuse in the Catholic Church. And that's when I fully had a reckoning with my own experiences, what had happened to me. And I think it was around 2020 when I'd seen Sanaka write a very humble kind of apology if he had been pushing things really hard. And maybe he was going to try and change tack or something. I forget. There was a letter of some kind, of an open letter that he wrote. And I just instantly thought, I have to help this gentleman. I have to help this gentleman to do this campaign. And we started this thing called the Vedic Inquirer. It was probably quite quiet for the first year, maybe 600 followers, something quite small, and a little bit of content going out. And it blew up in around April, May 2021. I particularly then aided Saraswati in a campaign. Now there's about 6,500 active contributors, and it's kind of taken off. But I might come back to it as well through a real long and winding road, if that's okay.
But I actually remember, I think it was around, you've just mentioned April 2021, I think.
Yes.
I remember that period of time. And I remember that I had joined the Vedic Inquirer, the Facebook group. And I remember being just quite amazed by the growth in the numbers daily, because you know how yourself or other admins at the time you can put thanks to our new members, and it would automatically generate the names. And I remember literally, it might not have been daily, but 2 or 3 times a week that you or other were thanking the new members, and it was hundreds every day. It was quite amazing in terms of the growth over that period of time.
It touched a nerve, and I think it was a forum that needed to happen. Until that forum, a lot of the corridor chat was going on, but it wasn't safe to talk about these things necessarily out in the open. And I think there was a lot of people who felt the need for a forum where they could discuss their concerns and feel it was safe to discuss their concerns and that would feel heard and so on. So I think it has fulfilled a need. Of course, it's going to be controversial. It's very uncomfortable subject matter. There's a lot of people who feel, it's problematic to air ISKCON's dirty laundry in public. I think it's much more problematic that there is so much dirty laundry and it's so dirty. We should be less concerned about what will people think of us if they know about these things, and more concerned with why have we got all this stuff and how can we actually get, breakthroughs. So it will probably remain controversial. Some people won't get it. I feel like it is performing a valuable public service, and I think it has actually bumped it up the list of priorities at the leadership level, at the GBC level, and so on. So I'm hopeful that we will get more and more breakthroughs, but it's not going to turn around a culture that's taken 50, 60 years to get this way. There's a lot of challenging that needs to happen. But can I also approach that same question from a slightly different angle as well?
Please do.
Yeah. So I think my first 5 or 6 years in ISKCON, it was the rose-colored glasses experience. I have to say, it was still a little different than what my uncle and aunt had led me to expect. They were so naturally hospitable. They had a simple living farm in Wales. It was very idyllic. I loved the simple living, high thinking ethic. And we would talk every night into the wee hours of the morning about his time in India, meeting Prabhupada, and I loved the music, and I loved the kirtan, and I loved the prasadam. And the first thing I really noticed when I joined was how much rank pulling there was, putting people in their place, blasting people. And it was so different by way of contrast to what I had experienced with them that I was a little thrown. Oh, okay, this is a little different. But mostly it was a very, very positive experience. I did, though, go through the mangle, I go through the mill, and had some pretty tough experiences. I don't necessarily want to go into big detail about that, but just fallouts, let's say, with ISKCON authorities and so on. So I found myself around 1990 wanting to get married, thinking about how I would earn my living as a householder, and not thinking I could be part of a machinery of the organization that I thought would probably mangle people. You know, I was feeling out of sorts in that way. But I had this challenge that my initiating spiritual master, Bhakti True Swami, said, I want you to work full-time for ISKCON and depend on ISKCON for your living. And I remember going in front of Radha Londoneshwar the day after I got that instruction. And it was like, you can't hesitate to execute the order of the spiritual master. But Lord Krishna, at this point, I'm not 100% sure how I can do that with integrity. How can I feel a part of something which doesn't feel as squeaky clean as it should be? And I'm worried is not necessarily the same movement that Prabhupada set in motion and so on. And I just prayed that they would, you know, show me a way that I could reconcile the sense of wanting to serve with integrity and, you know, fulfill the order of my spiritual master and all those things. The very next day, Shiv Ram Swami asked me to go to Belfast and run the temple. And I had thought, well, the only way I could actually reconcile it is if I could actually have the steering wheel and feel like I could, you know, guide things or take things in a particular direction. And Krishna thought so too, evidently. He thought, okay, let's give him a crack. Maybe it'll humble him. And it was quite humbling. My first year with, I think the devotees there were expecting someone a little bit more consultative. And I was probably a little bit more directive in terms of my style. And I wasn't quite clear why it wasn't really clicking. I mean, we kept the temple open. We were turning it out of the debt. You know, there were lots of things that were good about it. But the feel that I wanted between me and the devotees wasn't quite right. And I came away from it scratching my head a little bit. There was a devotee there, Shonika Rishi, part of the Oxford project. Very nice devotee and, you know, really thoughtful, father as a consultant. And he kind of switched me on to, you know, the concept of leadership training, management training and other things. And I realized, oh yeah, these are actually skills. It's not enough to just be a sincere devotee wanting to serve. Maybe you need some skills. When I then went back to London and we were in Soho Street for a while before I got into management there, I was now looking at managers through this lens that I'd been given and realizing why so many people had problems with managers. And it was mostly a skills or a style deficit. Before long, Shiv Ram Swami asked me to be the temple manager. And maybe a year or so after that, I became the temple president. It was around this time that His Holiness Sridhar Swami, Srila Prabhupada's disciple, Jolly Sannyasi, as is often called, introduced me and some other devotees there to a book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. So this was Stephen Covey's well-known, you know, framework, if you like, for organizing your life and, you know, developing some baseline skills, how to listen nicely to people, you know, a need that every leader should you know, be able to do these kind of things. And that became a bit of a playbook. It was also controversial. We might as well have been, you know, going to another Sangha or something. We were considered heretics. Why have you gone outside of Prabhupada's body of knowledge and learning things from some secular consultant? It was, you know, surprisingly controversial, especially because it is actually quite so aligned with Prabhupada's messaging. It just provides a few day-to-day how-tos. And then I attended something called the 4 Roles of Leadership. So this was the long and winding road to get to this point. This was a program about organizational leadership. 7 Habits are really about personal, interpersonal skills. This was about how to run an organization effectively. And there was this really fascinating model, which came at such the right time for me, having just gone to Bhaktivedanta Manor. And it introduced this idea that all organizations really only exist if they're relevant and stay relevant and compelling to a group of stakeholders. In commercial terms, if you don't actually give your customers what they need, you don't really have a business. You're not going to stay in business. And the world is littered with examples of companies that lost touch with customer needs. Blockbuster used to own the home entertainment market and then fell over. Nokia used to own mobile phone market and then fell over. Probably the most sobering is Kodak, who used to own photos. They went bankrupt on the same day that Instagram was floated, whilst they still owned the patent for the digital image. And that just beggars belief, right? But they were so invested in their print shops, they didn't keep track that the customer had actually now moved on to wanting to simply share things online, and print shops became irrelevant. And they, from one day to the next. So then it got me thinking, well, who are stakeholders in the ISKCON world? Who are all the different constituencies that deserve to be considered in our strategy, who either feel a sense of engagement and belonging or don't? And if they don't, what are the consequences for the organization, and so on? And the manor was a really interesting case in point. And I think most temples probably have a particular set of constituencies. It's not as basic as the commercial one, where customers buy a product, and if they're not buying it, you've got a problem instantly, and it directly impacts your sustainability as a business. We would have at any point in time the ashram residents, the temple staff, so not necessarily resident, but doing all the different duties and fulfilling the obligations, temple visitors, and they might be further divided into different demographic categories. You could say locals in the immediate vicinity who are part of the indigenous population of wherever that temple is, the Indian diaspora. You could even, at somewhere like Bhaktivedanta Manor, include the neighbors and the local community. Arguably, we got offside with them to the point where they were opposing our right to stay open. Now, did we exist in order to meet their needs? No, but we ignored their experience and their needs to the point of great detriment to our license to operate. I'll come back to that one in a moment. And it struck me, you could talk about the alumni, those who had been part of the pioneering days of the temple, and the manor has a big population of what I'd call alumni. Once lived in the ashram, now don't, but frequent the ashram, and definitely have different needs and expectations than an everyday visitor or the Indian diaspora. In using the term Indian diaspora, it might be a problematic term, but I'm not meaning to suggest they're a different kind of devotee at strata level, but they have a different expectation and a different criteria by which they judge their experience. I think we do very well, mostly around the world, with that population. But we might be missing the mark with the average Englander on the streets or the average Aussie on the streets. We might be missing the mark with Gurukulis, those who were born in the movement. We might be missing the mark with those who were former pioneers and now feel a little bit like left by the wayside, and that they don't have a voice where they should have one. So it struck me that if I was going to really run Bhaktivedanta Manor well, I should make a great interest of looking at the needs and expectations of each of these groups, their experience, and try and deliberately tailor an experience they would find that valued them, that heard them, that they found engaging. And I feel like this is actually a vital strategy generally for ISKCON's well-being and thriving. And the first two groups, this is again long and winding road, first two groups that I thought of that I felt especially were sorely neglected were the older devotees who used to live in the temple and now felt neglected, and the Gurukulis. Those were the two groups that it actually pained me to think, these are such important constituent groups. Why aren't we doing the right thing by them? Why are we neglecting them? Why don't we seem to care about their experience or their needs? And it's a tragedy that all that talent is going to waste because it's trying to find a sense of value maybe elsewhere. Anyway, sorry, that was a very, but that's one of the reasons I think that the Coolie experience is so important to me and has been since that time.
You know, it's funny. I was having a conversation with somebody yesterday, and we were talking about how, in most societies, actually in all societies, you can often judge that society or make judgments about that society based on how it treats its most vulnerable. And in all societies, generally, the most vulnerable are the youngest and the oldest. And we were talking about that in relation to ISKCON, actually, in relation to how does ISKCON treat its most youngest and most oldest. So it's just very interesting that we're expressing these same thoughts and ideas today. Okay, there's so many things that I know we've still got to go through, and I know in one sense we're only touching on the surface because you and I could probably chat for hours about certain topics. ISKCON, notably the GBC, so the leadership or the management of ISKCON, have let millions of children down by allowing child abusers to, I don't like this expression, I'm going to use it, roam free within the movement for decades. Why has the GBC been so ineffective, and reluctant to protect children?
Yeah, I mean, it's the GBC and to some extent the larger community as well. Obviously, the GBC as the ultimate managing authority, we're often reminded that they're the ultimate managing authority. So that sort of translates into the buck stops here. I think there's a lot of reasons why devotees have not somehow come to terms with these things. There's a lot of transcendental philosophizing. So maybe we come across someone suffering, and rather than feel a natural human compassion, we might be more tempted to try and explain it through the books and tell people how they should think about it and feel about it. And I'm readily confessing that used to be me. I used to do that to people. I think there is almost a deifying sometimes of the movement. So people were so indebted to Srila Prabhupada and felt that ISKCON was the vehicle that was going to save the world, that when child abuse first came to the surface, devotees were not even ready to acknowledge it as a real thing. And they prefer to just suppress information about it because it would make the movement look bad. And so you can see, actually, someone's been sharing on Vedic Inquirer a lot of these documentaries from the 70s and 80s about interviews with kids, and the outer world was starting to say, hey, what about these Krishna kids and so on? And such a glossy impression was created about how this was the most fortunate birth and these kids are really being looked after and they've got the best of everything. All the meanwhile, a lot of those devotees being interviewed would have known that there was this kind of Holocaust going on. I mean, there's a famous picture that does the rounds from time to time of the Daras Gurukul. I don't know what year it's from, maybe 72, 73. I know my wife's in the picture. And someone's gone through and put crosses and ticks and other things against it. And it's truly shocking that there's probably only about two of the some that have left their bodies and maybe at their own hands. There's a lot that are just completely disinterested. And then maybe there's a couple who are still somewhat actively involved, and some have got a favorable relationship with Krishna consciousness, if not ISKCON. But in terms of Prabhupada's hope, failed so badly. So I think we had a lot of very naive ideas. We did think we were going to take over the world, and we didn't really think we needed any skills. We thought we were just going to be so sincere it would happen. There's that famous conversation with Giriraj Maharaj, where Prabhupada wakes him up in the middle of the night, something about how will Krishna consciousness go on after I've left? Purity, sincerity, no, organization and intelligence. So I might not be doing it justice, but that's my sense of its provenance. So, you know, devotees were put in charge of the Gurukul project that actually really didn't know what they were doing. And sometimes staff was sent there who they couldn't think of what else to do with them. They were the misfits that weren't, going out on Sankirtan or whatever. And let's put them with the kids. There was no vetting. There was no background checks. We didn't even think maybe that the kids needed much of an academic education. They were all going to be kshatriyas or, run farms so there's little thought. I mean, my wife told me she more or less taught herself to read when she was 9. I mean, that's just shocking to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not going to detail all the kinds of abuse that went on. I don't know how much of it even reached Prabhupada's ear. We do have some famous instances where it did come to his attention, and he talked about they should hang the teachers. That first Gurukul was closed, I think, by the government in around 1975, maybe. Others will correct me, no doubt, if I've not got this quite right. But I think this idea, let's make the movement absolutely needs to appear glossy and perfect. And I think we see the same attitudes today with people saying, don't talk about this stuff. It will give people the wrong idea. Is it the wrong idea? Or is telling them that it is all glossy when it's actually not, and kids are in harm's way sometimes? Is that the wrong idea? Is it fair to people to hush it up and try and make a good impression? So I think that's their explaining away things philosophically. It's your karma if you suffer, that kind of stuff. I think the GBC definitely suffers from a lack of competence. And I'd also say they've got this misdirected sympathy. So one of their comrades who's been a sadhaka for the same time as them, lovely devotee, know him really well. Oh, child abuse. Oh, well, we have to forgive him. We, no one's damned forever. So let's give him another chance. So I think these kind of attitudes contribute together, not wanting to deal with it, feeling uncomfortable, wanting to paint the image of the movement, glossy way, misdirected sympathies. Like quite often, if let's say something comes to the GBC's attention, one of the first questions is, oh, how many disciples does he have? So the first calculation is not who suffered and, how devastating is that for their lives and what will it mean and how will it, they're thinking, oh, too big to fail. This guy's got so many disciples, maybe we'll lose a bunch. We did lose a bunch of gurus and disciples in the 80s, so maybe we're still reeling from that, and now we want to patch it up. And maybe the more gurus who fall, the more legitimate questions there are about whether we've got succession right. So all of these factors, I think, come in. I'm probably not doing it justice, but these are just some initial ideas about why it is. I think there's a lot of cowardice. So we've seen in the last few days in Mayapur, there's an abuse case that's still sitting with CPO. They've got a big backlog and underfunded. And there are victims seeing their abusers on a daily basis. And the management aren't even enforcing the restrictions that the CPO put forward when someone's under investigation. And so we're now seeing footage of one of the victims confronting the abuser. Why are you here? Why are you not observing your restrictions? And so on. People just having to fend for themselves. There are some fairly high-profile abusers involved in Temple of Vedic Planetarium. And there's this sense of walking around with impunity and being untouchable. So all of these things together, people are absolutely looking for a zero tolerance response from the GBC. And the GBC do have language like that in some of their resolutions, but they don't enforce it.
Do you think things will ever change?
Yeah, I think so.
And in terms of, in your head or in your mind, do you have like a time scale? We're looking at 10 years, 20 years, until in terms of when the GBC will take child protection seriously?
I think the amount of noise that's being made, they're at the point where they're recognizing we have to be seen to be doing something, and we have to. And look, the reason I often use incompetence isn't to get them off the hook. It is to say that many of them may actually be concerned. They're just not translating it into timely actions. Apparently, there's a recent inquiry that was done on the Mayapur and Vrindavan Gurukulas, and that's being followed up by some other, phase twos of those things. So I think we will get there kicking and screaming. How long it'll take, it's difficult to know. Sometimes we take 2 steps forward and then a whole bunch back. With the famous Mayapur Gurukul horrific decades-long abuse, there were 8 reports, something like this, that were submitted to the GBC detailing what was going on, and somehow it was only after the 8th that action was really taken.
And in terms of now, in terms of the first report and the 8th, what was the time scale? Over a 10-year period, or 5 or 20?
Yeah, more like 20. I think there were reports coming out in the late 80s.
Wow.
There was certainly enough evidence, if anyone was paying attention, there was some very, very alarming things going on. Sexual abuse of children, harsh punishments, and it was rife. And it's really disconcerting to think that no one just stood up and took some action there. And of course, we're now getting more and more testimonials from people whose lives were destroyed by their experiences. I mean, we're talking hundreds of kids over decades, 30, 40 years. The other thing I was going to say, though, is we take, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So somehow or other, the Indian CPO wants to be separate from the international CPO. They don't have child protection qualifications. It actually seems more about, we just want to have a different standard over here and not be accountable. So this is horrific. Even when you think you're starting to make headway, you get these other little power trips playing out. And it's got nothing to do with keeping kids safe.
What kind of, the word isn't relationship, but what kind of relationship or connection do you personally have with the GBC in terms of being able to air concerns, or because I noticed online recently you'd emailed the GBC or somebody about something, I can't remember what it was, and how did the GBC deal with you and your concerns and your emails? What's that connection like?
Mostly they ignore me, I'd say, although the noise is loud enough that somehow they often figure something has to be done. Back in the 90s, I mean, I became TP at the Manor, I think I was 28, something like that. And I was going to the GBC meetings, not as a GBC, but as some kind of, it wasn't called deputy, there was some kind of assistant role. I was helping Naveen Krishna Prabhu. And there are times I would actually prepare resolutions for them to vote on and, help to expedite the process. And I remember having this conscience call. It was shortly after my brother had passed away in 95, just when I first went to the Manor. And I thought, oh, well, if I really want it, I'm on the fast track to, a very senior ISKCON role, 28 being the TP of the Manor. That was already, something. And my conscience was a little troubled. I don't know if this is the right path for me. Am I actually making change, which is the only reason I would want to be in one of these kind of positions? Or am I also part of the problem? Maybe I can make change from the outside. So I still have many relationships from those times, and I've been involved since as well. So growing up in London, at the temples, I just about met everybody. And then, like in 2013, I helped the strategic planning team do some facilitation of GBC Guru Sannyasis things. So I was mingling, and there was a lot of, I was a known quantity, and there was a lot of affection and all these kind of things. I think as soon as I started banging the drum that change is needed, we need more competence and so on, I think I just started to get frozen out. There was a few of us a year or so ago who put a letter together, given the child abuse, catastrophic failures, and other things like seeming to lose control of ISKCON India, the reverse on the Vaishnavis initiating. We just sort of put a letter together. We were inspired actually by the Guru reform movement of the 1980s, when the zonal acharya system was dismantled. The 50-man committee, as it was known. So we got 50 signatures on this letter of senior people saying, "Dear GBC, in light of all of these real big problems and your apparent inability to satisfactorily deal with them, in light of the plummeting trust and credibility, we really think you should stand aside and have an honest appraisal of how you're going." Either, I call it, from having had an HR background, I call it the spill and fill. Everybody steps aside, and then we think about who's best for those roles. And many of them might end up back in the roles, but it's a good faith exercise to say, I might be the ultimate managing authority, but I'm also accountable to the devotees that I'm meant to be leading. And I'm now going to take some feedback, and I'm now going to submit to some kind of review of my performance. They weren't happy with this letter. And there may have even been some reprisals. There may even be the dismantling of Sabha and other things, as a consequence, because many Sabha people signed it. One GBC who was in the room said, tomorrow's Ram Navami, folks. How would Lord Ram deal with a message like this coming from the citizenry? And so a few of them did reach out to us and wanted to understand our concerns. There was a bit of back and forth for a while. It seemed maybe a little promising. And then before long, we were in the deep freeze. Nowadays, a lot of messages that I send just get bounced back, whatever email, automated message.
For anyone who's not sure, can you just remind us what Sabha was or is?
Oh yeah, sorry,
Don't worry.
I'm presuming a lot here.
Don't worry.
So the GBC have always had some kind of advisory body. When Srila Prabhupada first wrote the direction of management, it was the temple managers who would go to Mayapur, review the minutes of the GBC meeting, and might send some of them back for rethinking. So this idea that there was still a House of Lords and a House of Commons, or two chambers or whatever, I don't know, Congress and the House of Representatives. I don't know enough about American politics, but as the movement expanded and wasn't just a confederation of temples, there was a recognition that vetting and that advice actually might come from a different representative body of devotees. And so this idea of spiritual advisory, not sure what the H is, Bhagavatam. Anyway, a spiritual advisory council of some kind. And it would include people from different ministries. There would be a Vaishnavi representative and something that represented the voice of the different constituents around the globe. And they would, again, review the GBC minutes, and if they felt like they wanted to send some back. And there are times where it's come pretty close, where Sabha have said, we don't really think this is a good policy. Some I can't mention. I think there was a fairly tense one around Vaishnavis initiating. I think that came pretty close to maybe being overturned. But I don't think the GBC were happy when a bunch of members of Sabha signed this letter and said, yeah, we do think you should subject yourselves to some review in good faith. And it's possible we may now revert back to the temple president's meeting. I did see a heavily saffroned bunch of pictures come out in the last few days. Saffron tent, shedding a saffron light on everyone, but a lot of saffron, a lot of
I saw that actually, and my my first reaction was I personally had never seen that before. I didn't know there was a meeting of temple presidents, and certainly, well, I've been on social media for years and I've been around the Hare Krishna movement for years. I didn't know there was a meeting of temple presidents. So that meeting we saw online the other day in Mayapur, does that happen every year or is that a new thing?
I think it's being re-established, having sort of faded away for a while. Exactly how it and Saba, will they coexist? Will the one consume the other or replace the other? Yet to be seen. I think there are about 150 TPs there, but that's actually quite a small fraction of the global estate, if you like, of temples. Quite possibly the Indian Yatra was disproportionately highly represented by contrast to many other places around the world. So it's kind of interesting to see how that will play out in due course.
Do you not think, I'm kind of preempting this, do you not think that the leadership of ISKCON, the GBC, the communications department would at least want to engage with you and liaise with you and address these concerns? Because actually what's happening is a bit of a PR disaster. You know, like the PR minister, I hate that term, the PR person is Anutama Prabhu, I think. So do you not think he would want to have a positive relationship or engagement process with yourself and other campaigners to try and at least address your concerns? Because what's happening is it's bad PR for ISKCON. I'm in support of what you're doing, by the way. I also get similar criticisms about, hey, you're encouraging people to talk about their satanic ritual abuse in public, their whatever in public. For me, it's more from a kind of a journalistic point of view that we should talk about things publicly. But do you not think Anutama would want to at least engage with what you're doing?
He and I have historically had quite a fond relationship. I wouldn't say it's soured beyond repair, but I think he doesn't like the approach that I take and is more inclined at this point to ignore and shut it out. Yeah, as a communications person, and it's interesting that you use the word PR, because I think he takes more of a PR mindset rather than a comms mindset. And it would be better to absolutely be listening. I'm not ISKCON's ill wisher. I'm not, let's smash it up. And I actually am trying to provoke reform. And I'm trying to use a fourth estate kind of strategy for that, hold people to account through media. I believe that 99% of ISKCON's problems would go away if leadership listened, if it truly decided that it was there to serve, the vast body of devotees and not to see their concerns as griping or whatever unhelpful, labels is put on it, but to see these are legitimate concerns by legitimate citizens, people who at some point have given their lives to Prabhupada. And it's not that anything's actually changed other than they now feel disenfranchised from his movement by those in management who have shut them out or just aren't interested in their point of view. I think it would be very wise if they listened. And that's why I kind of stress, I think there's a competence gap here. There's this thing called the Dunning-Kruger effect. If you don't know anything about management, you've also got no basis to judge whether or not you are a good manager. And so, how much learning have they done to be fit with the right competencies to execute these roles? Listening would be absolutely an essential capability. And most secular leaders know this. And it's sometimes painful what customers might tell them or what, staff might tell them. But they know that if they're going to lead that organization effectively and bring people on the journey, it's a price they have to pay, and they have to get their ego out of the way. I mean, this is one of the other challenges, is that many of them are gurus and therefore need to preserve, at least in their own minds, this sense of, being beyond faults and beyond correction and beyond instruction. And of course, that's a real problem, because maybe they're only ever really surrounded by people who are glorifying them as God's spokesperson, and not by someone who'll say, Maharaj, your slip is showing. I think there's some stuff that you need to look at here. I think that all of that's just seen as negative and Management's already hard enough. Leave me alone. I want to do my bhajan. I don't want to deal with all of this. I measure my success by how many people show up to my talks. And if they all look happy and enthused, I'm just going to decide the rest of you great unwashed grumblers out there, well, there's something wrong. Your consciousness is deranged and you're a lost cause.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just on this issue of addressing concerns around child abuse or putting in better child protection measures, but almost on every single issue, it's almost as if the GBC has developed this desire not to listen to the laity. We don't want to listen to the people at the bottom, the grassroots, the people that go out day in, day out and distribute the books, distribute the prasadam. Why is that? Because I mean, I've been around, like yourself, I've been around different working environments for years in the charity sector, the business sector, and I have to say, I have never been involved with or experienced this in any other organization. This almost desire that the leadership has not to listen to the laity. Why is the GBC like that?
Beyond what I've shared already. I mean, it is especially astonishing where one of the virtues that we glorify, even on a daily basis, is humility and being of service. So it's truly astonishing that there's this kind of closedness to other people. I think many of them are in siege mentality. So they actually can't even discern between someone who is just griping, almost, casual, what's the word I often use? Not casual. Just recreational outrage, recreational criticism. And they can't distinguish actually between that and legitimate concerns coming from people who really want to see the best happen to Srila Prabhupada's movement. And it's unfortunate. They've got themselves in that classic ivory tower. And it's true. It's so at contrast with most of the rest of the world now, and this sense that leadership teams are listening to people. It's astonishing that in a society of Vaishnavas, we've got this totally other ethos going on. It's hard to explain. It's insecurity, it's arrogance, it's Dunning-Kruger effect.
Do you think it's also because certainly not, they don't see themselves, or they're not kind of democratically accountable? I know that there's been a lot online recently in terms of yourself and others reminding us that actually the terms of office or in office should be just, I think, 3 years or something like that. But actually some of the GBCs have been there for 50 years or 40 years. Is it in reality because of that there isn't that democratic accountability, or even in a business there wouldn't be democratic accountability, but there's accountability to a line management system or a check and balance system, but that check and balance system in ISKCON, in the GBC, just doesn't exist?
Yeah, so people will trace the origins back. Of course, Srila Prabhupada often spoke, disparagingly of democracy, but I think that should be understood in context. Srila Prabhupada wrote a document when he established the GBC. In fact, it's one of the GBC's founding documents from which it traces its legitimacy, direction of management. And that's where he particularly talked about 3-year terms, and that temple presidents would vote a GBC in and so on. Now, later on, although Prabhupada, I think there might have been 1 or 2 such elections. I think Bhaktivedanta Manor actually did have one, and it was highly contested, and maybe it turned a little bit more political than was seen as helpful. And so maybe there was a walking away from that. And then toward the end, certainly in those famous conversations on, was it May the 9th? Others will remind me, but the famous appointment conversation, kind of very controversial. Did Prabhupada appoint Ritviks or not?
Oh, July the 9th, the
July the 9th
letter, yeah, 77, yeah.
77. So there was in that very conversation where I think Satsvarup Maharaj, maybe Tamal Krishna Maharaj were asking Prabhupada about what the arrangement should be, there was a conversation about GBCs, and Prabhupada said GBCs for life. But he also said they must be of ideal character, and if necessary, they can be replaced. So it wasn't like unaccountable, you know, for the rest of time. But they've really run with this GBC for life and turned it into some kind of Vedic aphorism as every bit as true and eternally so and immutable as Aham Brahmasmi. And they're now not willing to be subject to anyone else's scrutiny. So I don't think Srila Prabhupada intended to create an oligarchy instead of a democracy, an unaccountable group of men. But that seems to be what we've ended up with. Prabhupada was also famous for time, place, and circumstance and judging things by their results. And so if he did move away from the precise interpretation of Dom as he originally wrote it in 1970, he would also be taking stock of what we've got at the moment. And if we've got a situation where people's judgment has been so deeply impaired, their loyalty is so deranged, and the catastrophic impact it's having on people's engagement and their trust and so on, he would be intervening. He wouldn't simply say, oh, well, you know, our hands are tied. The ultimate managing authority, that means that even Krishna has to respect that we're the top dogs over here. So I do think it's used as a shield to hide behind, and not necessarily always in good faith. People are attached to position and the perks and privilege and maybe the status that goes with that. If you've got a servant leadership orientation and your service is failing, you would absolutely humbly submit yourself for review and get trained and be willing to be held accountable. But if you just want to play that, I'm the ultimate managing authority, I'm here for life, yikes. I mean, one of the other outrages is we're not seeing much in the way of succession planning. Prabhupada also spoke heavily about politicians who held on well past their competence and sell-by date to position and didn't actually make room for others to come along. Let's face it, older men, a lot of these men now are in their 70s and 80s. They might not have the get up and go that the movement really needs to drive something dynamic. Maybe they do just want to write their books and do their bhajan and instruct a few disciples. But we need people who are prepared to get their hands dirty and drive abusers out of the organization, for instance. Or put a strategy together. How will we actually get to every town and village? Rather than, have we kept the lights on and, you know, do plenty of people turn up for my talk?
Yeah, I talk about this often in the UK in the context of temple presidents. I'm sure it's the same in most countries. So a high number of the temple presidents in the UK have been in place for 15, 20 years. And I say to people, imagine if your local councillor or your local MP or your local representative had been in place for 20 years. You start to get a bit kind of bored, maybe, you know, you want some change. You start to feel a bit stagnant. And even though there's a spiritual element to, there should be a spiritual element to ISKCON, it's the same. You know, someone's been in place for 20 years and there's no sign of them moving on or stepping down or retiring. People become complacent. And I know one community in the UK where pretty much the whole congregation has walked out because they haven't seen any change for 20 years and they're fed up with everything that's gone with that. And so, yeah.
I proposed to the SPT, Strategic Planning Team, so this is a team that works with the GBC around setting strategy. And I proposed that we actually introduce a survey. Every temple, everywhere in the world, surveys its constituencies on an annual basis, so we can actually measure engagement. Most companies have an engagement index of some kind where they want to get a read. Are our staff happy, planning to stay around, feel like they want to do the work, or are they disengaged and disillusioned? Because that will have a predictive impact on whether we perform well. And so what if we were to get a regular read on, you know, what is the woman's experience in our society? What do they expect? What are they looking for? How are we doing for them? What about if we get a read on how well we're performing for children? What if we did get a read on, and then we could make decisions. Oh, look, we're really succeeding with this constituency over here. They love the deity worship. They love the kirtans. They love the prasadam and the festivals. Oh, this group over here, the Gurukulis, totally different criteria by which they either engage or disengage. And it doesn't look like we're really attending or catering for that constituency particularly well. Let's make more of a deliberate effort to do that. And my view is that every temple president should be held accountable for improving their engagement metrics. And every strategy at a local temple should be informed by that annual survey. Right now, just as you're saying, you could have a temple like the one you've described where the president is presiding over an exodus. It's not visible. Maybe it is, anecdotally or whatever, but no one's tracking that. No one's going to hold them accountable for that. Now, you can guarantee that if the temple went under financially, that would generate an immediate consequence. Most organizations nowadays have this idea of a balanced scorecard. So they're not only measuring, can we keep the lights on? Did we put enough money in the bank account? But they're measuring things like, how's our outreach? How well are we looking after the faith and commitment of the people who attach themselves to this community? If someone's actually liquidating the goodwill of the local community, they're a liability. They should either be retrained or they should be replaced. But otherwise, we've got these sort of individual godmen having the time of their lives, maybe, potentially living off the perks of the local temple, and they could actually be doing a total disservice to the movement. And right now, it's not even visible. No one's tracking it. No one's holding them accountable.
I do like your idea of a survey. I think that sounds very good. That's actually a great answer to my next question, which is, what can the GBC do to address the needs of ISKCON stakeholder groups? And that's a great kind of idea, isn't it? A survey that members of the grassroots, the laity, could complete and return.
Well, and that's why I think it goes side by side with strategy, because that feeds into your strategy conversation. But then you're immediately saying, who do we want to optimize for? Are we trying to be all things to all people? Right now, we seem to be doing a great job with the Indian community. And I'm not criticizing that. They make great devotees. They are fired up about Krishna consciousness. This is a success. But often there's lamenting that it's the only community that we seem to be winning with, and maybe we've optimized for. So even, for instance, the temple resident, at the moment, exactly what do they get from their experience? They give their free labor for a few years. They get board and lodgings. They might get a bit of an education, but it's possibly a little haphazard. We've not designed a curriculum that says, after 5 years in the brahmachari ashram, you will not only be ready to potentially move on to married life, if that's your choice, but you'll actually, be able to make a decent living in the world and be well set up for a successful marriage. Right now, someone typically comes to the end of the brahmachari existence and then, good luck, have a good life. We might see you at the Sunday feast. So we haven't decided what's the offering that we want to make to that constituency. Arguably, the temple staff, often salaried, they might be getting quite a good deal out of the whole system. I remember back in the day, this was even before salaries were quite such a big thing, at Soho Street and at the Manor, salaries might be somewhere between 25 and 50% of the total overhead. That was, and I'm not knocking, different people have different views. I think to pay someone a stipend, no one was going to get rich on these salaries. And we were trying to buy in a set of skills that was, not easy to necessarily acquire. But it was a big part. So if it's all about, are we just keeping the lights on and paying the bills, but a lot of that is just the maintenance of the very staff members, it does become a little self-serving. So again, I come back to the big neglected constituencies, the older devotees who gave their life, the pioneers. What are their needs? What are their expectations? What's their experience? How do we keep them engaged? Does anyone concern that we've actually lost so much talent, so much experience that it's sitting on the sidelines wondering if anyone cares? And the coolies, the next generation. I mean, at all kinds of levels, even just from a strategy level. If we lose our youth and fail to transfer Krishna consciousness into the youth, how long is our movement going to be around for? So we need to optimize. So the survey is one thing, but then deciding what's the offering that we make, and let's bake it into a strategy and then hold people accountable for that strategy too. And I think it should include, if you've got a temple in central London, what's the plan to reach the people of London? And what messages are we trying to convey, and how are we seeking to engage them? Yeah. Anyway, long.
Yeah, I mean, Srila Prabhupada was so enthusiastic and keen about local temples being autonomous and reaching out to the local community, and really serving the local community. So I absolutely agree with what you're saying there, and I often think about the temples in the UK and what they're doing to serve the needs, or try and serve the needs of local British people. What are they doing to reach out? I mean, Bhaktivedanta Manor is huge, and that's wonderful. It's great that there's big festivals and lots of people go. But if you went there on well, not just a Sunday, but any day now, to find a large number of Western people, that doesn't happen so much anymore. Where are all the Western converts? Where are we hiding? Why don't we go to the temples so much anymore? Why are so many of my peers feeling disillusioned? Or why have they left Krishna consciousness completely? Why have they joined other mats, other sanghas? What isn't ISKCON providing for them anymore? So it's great that lots of wonderful people of Indian background go to Bhaktivedanta Manor for festivals, but why do the Western devotees on a Saturday struggle to get the minibus full to go on a Harinam? And why did they struggle to get money out of the temple management to put fuel in the van? Where are the priorities?
In the early days of the movement, there was actually a viable value proposition for the young people of America, for the young people of Europe and various other places. And, it was a different era, but there was a sociological need in the youth. I want to be part of changing the world. I want to be part of something I can fully believe and buy into. Ashrams were all the rage. We weren't the only people running ashrams that were having a field day, but we certainly were doing something. Now, obviously, sociological change happens, and we had the added disillusionment of the 80s. So Srila Prabhupada leaves, and we get all these acharyas who turn out not to be up to the job. And there was a lot of heartache. And we did actually well in some ways to survive the 80s and through the 90s. But in many ways, we transferred the economic dependence from book distributors, which was the sort of economic model then, over to donors from the Indian community. And that became almost the obsession and focus. And everybody else became surplus to requirements. And I don't think we don't have a viable value proposition for local people anymore. What are we offering? What do they want? What do they need? What are they looking for? Now, we're doing a little bit with yoga kind of stuff. That's, attracting a certain segment, maybe. Kirtan culture is definitely picking up around the place, and we sort of surprisingly weren't really at the vanguard of that, even though we started it in the 60s and 70s. But we're in there now, and we're quite popular in that kind of space. But yeah, people aren't joining ashrams and giving their life to, cultures like ours anymore. So what is the offer? Namhatas is something, but it could be more deliberate as opposed to a little bit haphazard. What are we deliberately going to do for the next generation? How are we going to set them up? What education do we want to offer them? what level of engagement in Krishna consciousness? Are we training them for careers in Krishna consciousness? Are we even giving them the experience that might make them want that? So strategy, I think, is a big thing.
Wonderful. I was just looking at my last question. What's been great, actually, I think, by the questions that we've been going over is that actually we've had this wonderful flow, and you've been, I think, very good at kind of linking stuff together. I mean, my last question was, how can we ensure that ISKCON really is a house in which the whole world can live? And you've certainly provided some ideas of how that could happen. I mean, for me, it's on a more human level of just treating people with respect and accepting people and trying to include people irrespective of their background or their sexuality or their political persuasions, and trying to really reach out to local communities and treating people with respect. And when you have a leadership that doesn't appear to want to listen to the laity, people don't feel that they're being engaged with. You know, people just don't feel that they want to be part of the organization. So I would love for ISKCON to feel like it is a house in which the whole world can live, just as Srila Prabhupada wanted it to be. But we are so far away from that. It's the Christians, for all their faults, I think the Christians can be a bit better at that. You know, I know a number of churches in my community where people are more welcomed and included. You know, there isn't this kind of, you know, what time did you get up this morning? Have you read your Bible today? You know, how many did you do your 30 minutes of intercessory prayer? I think that, yeah, there's so much more to be done to ensure that ISKCON really is a house for the whole world to live in.
Well, Srila Prabhupada did and still does this most amazing job of conveying the value of Krishna consciousness. People get a book even now and they get excited, and it's Prabhupada that's really doing it. But of course, as soon as people get enthused and they also read, oh yes, you need to be a part of a sangha, you need to, you know, go to a temple, you need to really take on the whole lifestyle, they naturally want fellowship with others. And this is where we're not providing that fellowship experience that's great. It's one of the most painful things to me is to think, how many people around the world at some point in their life had their faith awakened by Krishna consciousness, but then their faith did actually went through some sort of detrimental experience and withering and confusion and so on. And now they still feel fondness for Srila Prabhupada. Maybe they still have some practices, but the mission that was meant to fully engage them and all that available talent, it's just not working in that way. And this is absolutely a leadership challenge. And I wonder, does this keep leaders awake at night or not? Or are they happy enough that the temple room is full when they get there? So it's all good.
Before we finish today, can we just go back to this really important issue of child protection?
Yeah.
Because there may be people watching this podcast, listening to this podcast, that do have a child protection concern in their temple or in their community. And if you're, I don't know, I'm trying to pick a random, okay, I won't pick a town or a city, but if you're a devotee serving in a community or in a devotee community and you have a child protection concern, what should you do? How can or should you raise your concerns about a certain issue?
Well, I believe every temple around the world, every community around the world is meant to have a child protection team. So, and that should even be advertised. I mean, in many places, there's even a little notice somewhere on the notice board telling you who the local contact might be. But I'd certainly, if there isn't anything advertised, I'd make inquiries with the temple management. Who is the right person in the child protection team? Now, it's a massive red flag if you don't get a straightforward answer to that question. And there is an international child protection office. And if you even just Google ISKCON, child protection, you will find those officers. In the current directors internationally are Hare Krishna, who's based around the Manor area, lives in Watford. And his wife Gandavika is also super active. They're both trained professionals in this field MAs in advanced child protection. And they may also be able to provide information of a local person if you don't get that from the temple. But yes, the idea is, since 1998, ISKCON has had a child protection office. Scarily, around the late 90s, we had this massive court case where a lot of Gurukulis, raised concerns about their problems. There was a big payout, and it seems that that's what prompted the GBC at the time to say, well, we need a child protection office. In its first year of operation, it had a $160,000 a year budget. The current budget for the current CPO office is $10,000 a year. And the caseload has only increased. So this is kind of shocking. Most of those child protection teams around the place will be voluntary. They will be trained devotees in most cases, but it's not 100% guaranteed. Most of them will deliver some kind of training. So I would absolutely see if you can search out your local person, discuss your concerns. That might just be to get some training, or there might in fact be an issue that concerns you. And then they have all kinds of protocols that are followed to investigate. But you definitely have the International Child Protection Office as your backup.
And if people feel that they're not getting results or they're disillusioned with that process, is there any way for them to contact yourself or other campaigners for advice or support?
They're definitely always welcome to come and get information or raise concerns or issues at the Vedic Inquirer. And there's a lot of, as I say, there's about 6,000 people, but there's some of us especially active there. I have to point out that the Child Protection Office is not an instead of law enforcement. So more often than not, if a child protection concern is raised, the first thing that the child protection people will do is to say, let's get law enforcement involved. Now, there might be times if it's an aged case and so on, that law enforcement is no longer interested, statute of limitations and these kind of things. At the very least, the child protection people will provide support, provide counseling, ensure that maybe some local restrictions are in place, that a person who may have actually transgressed is not allowed that free rein around the place, and others are warned and they don't have an official position anymore. But this is certainly a work in progress, and we wish that ISKCON's leaders were a little bit more inclined to fully cooperate. But yeah, it's never meant to be a substitute for law enforcement. And, a lot of these people will reoffend and should be locked up and should go on sex offender registries. It's very rare that it's just a one-off isolated case. And we need to take them out of circulation. And law enforcement is the appropriate channel.
Amen to that. I remember talking to one devotee who was in a different mat from ISKCON a couple of years ago, and he sees all these things online, and he says, Narada, I don't understand why you don't just all call the police. I said, I think people do call the police, but that's a very serious, that's a very key point to raise. We do need to. I often find within organizations like ISKCON, we can be kind of like, or we appear to be like maybe the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormons, where they want to deal with things behind closed doors, and we'll have internal investigations. So I do find it quite comforting that you're reminding us of that actually there is a process for phoning or contacting the police, contacting local law enforcement as well, which is very important.
Well, and the benefit of doing side by side CPO plus law enforcement. Law enforcement can sometimes, they'll certainly have trained professionals who, handle taking witness statements and so on with care. But they're also looking for, do we have enough evidence to secure a conviction here? And sometimes that's hard in child protection cases. Sometimes the child actually might be so young that they can barely, describe what happened to them. Sometimes it's actually because it happened a year ago. Many people don't report abuse till many years later. So sometimes it's hard to gather evidence, or that the
mm.
evidence is not considered all that reliable. So law enforcement will absolutely drive for a conviction if it can. CPO is also a backup then, because in a court of law, someone is found guilty beyond reasonable doubt. Because the child protection team has not got the power to imprison somebody, or other kinds of things like that, it actually has a slightly lower standard of evidence, preponderance of evidence. They will hear the statements of the accused, they'll hear the statements of the victims, and they'll make a judgment call around how credible the information is. And let's say, for instance, someone has been imprisoned. Maybe they only served 3 years and then they're back out. The CPO will ensure that that person is not able to freely move around a community, because it's not that the risk is over, even if they've paid their dues. And let's say someone doesn't even go to, it doesn't get a custodial sentence or whatever. They'll still make sure that there are safeguards in place in that local ISKCON community so that other children are not at risk. So I hope that everyone will get to see the benefits of actually these two collaborative channels, and both of them are highly important.
Thank you for that. Just before we finish, I would love to just give a final plug to the Vedic Inquirer Facebook group, because there will be some people listening to this or watching this that are not part of the Vedic Inquirer Facebook group or have never heard of it. So I would encourage anyone and everyone to join. Do you just briefly, Prabhu, want to tell us a bit about the group and what it does?
Yeah, well, when we saw that we weren't making the kind of headway that we would expect with child protection, Seneca had been battling out there for years, his films and other things. We thought, let's try a little bit more of a concerted lobbying. So it fulfills a number of purposes. One is simply to create awareness. How does abuse show up? What impact does it have on a person's life? What are the red flags that you might want to look for? How can you keep people safe? If abuse does happen, how should we be responding as a community? At times, it might even let people know about abusers that are at large. Sometimes we even do mini fundraisers for CPO. We certainly do a lot of petitioning of leadership to actually get its act together and take these things seriously. And even there's information on there about healing from abuse and various other things. So it's a kind of, child protection central, covering lots of different things. There are about 6,500 members. As you can well imagine, with sensitive subject matter, sometimes there can be harrowing accounts that are on there. We do, of course, try to deal with everybody with sensitivity, but it's definitely not for the faint-hearted. And we certainly need people to behave themselves. If someone's starting to open up that this is what happened to me and so on, we don't want someone just sort of preaching to them around, well, you've got to see it as Krishna's mercy and it's your karma, and oh, well, you shouldn't be speaking badly about devotees. All of that kind of stuff is obviously not helpful to the victim. So we try and make it a safe place. And certainly people would be very welcome to participate. Yeah, thank you for mentioning.
No worries. Well, believe it or not, Damodar Prabhu, we've been talking for almost an hour and a half recording this podcast. And it's been great to have you as I'm not sure whether it's lucky or unlucky, the 113th guest on the Hare Krishna Project podcast. I'm pleased that we finally got around to arranging this after some time. And I do hope that people watching this, listening to this, will maybe be inspired to take action. Will want to make a difference. Will maybe be encouraged to share what's happened to them if they haven't already and they want to. There are still people coming forward reporting experiences of abuse. And that's not just child abuse. I speak to people every now and then that have experienced other types of abuse within the Hare Krishna movement: psychological abuse, racism, transphobia. We're living in the material world, even within the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. These things unfortunately happen. So if anyone's feeling encouraged, please do get in touch with Damodara Prabhu, who will be able to advise and give some information. So a big thank you to Damodar Prabhu for being our 113th guest on the Hare Krishna Project podcast.
Thank you, Narada.
A big thank you to everyone who's watching this on YouTube. If you are, please do leave some feedback. We love to receive feedback, but it needs to be constructive. I do like to hear from people. I had one comment recently, and this particular devotee is now presenting his criticisms in a more positive way. So he's not so aggressive. He's explaining more diplomatically why he's unhappy about something. And I like that. So do not forget, if you're watching this on YouTube or Facebook, to leave some constructive criticism or constructive feedback, rather, generally good and bad. Please also follow the Hare Krishna Project Facebook page and YouTube channel. And until next week, I'll see you all soon. Thank you. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.